Are you interested in what is the one skill that your children need more than emotional awareness? My name's Jodie Thornton, and today I want to talk about what this skill is, why it's more important than emotional awareness, and why it's kind of not taught anywhere. So the first thing I want to say is that it's actually not resilience either, and it's not going to be any of the skills that you would expect to hear from somebody who spends all of their time talking about emotions and emotional awareness and how to communicate. It's actually the skill of evaluation. And the reason that this is so important is that when we think about how our children are going to be in the world, like how are they going to be able to make decisions about their own behaviour, how are they going to be able to correct themselves, how are they going to be able to even acknowledge what are their own values, let alone how do they live those in life, it really comes back to this skill of being able to evaluate what is going on for me, what has happened, did it work, did it not work? And I want to talk about how this kind of comes up a lot. And it's because in our current way of parenting, we've kind of swung from one extreme to another. So if we think back a few generations, even maybe one generation, parenting was very hands-off. So you'll see a lot of memes where people say, my parents would tell me to get out of the house and come back when the street lights came on, right? There'll be other times where kids are just completely unsupervised. I know for myself, in primary school, which is elementary school in the States, I would go after school. There was nobody at home, and I would take my bike and drive to the next suburb. And when I think back about how busy those roads were, I'm surprised, that was allowed, because when we think about what we do today, we don't leave them alone very much. We don't let them explore very much because of the safety factors. Now, this doesn't mean that we need to revert back to old ways of parenting, but what it does mean is that our kids lose a lot of the freedom that requires them to actually pick up the skill of evaluating risk, evaluating choices, evaluating how things work. And so when we think about the changes in our parenting approaches and how that impacts kids, this is one of them. We've reduced the opportunities for kids to make their own decisions. And then when we add to them how we work in interpersonal skills, back in the day, it was very much about kind of judgment. You were told what you were and what was and wasn't acceptable, if I can spit out the words, and so then you towed the line, right? Or you rebelled, one or the other. Now we are much more controlling in general about how we handle things. So if anything goes wrong, we get really anxious about it, and we have to make it. We have to control it and make a change. And you see this in parenting groups where we're continually asking questions about how do I handle this or how do I handle that. You see this in how we ask our friends, I'm really not sure what is this going to mean down the track. And it's not only are we very we're white knuckling through parenting these days, we're looking at things we're looking at back to the past of what happened for us, the people we know and stories we've heard, to look at how we handle things so that the future has a better chance of working out. We spend very little time in the present, very, very little time in the present. And so where does that leave our kids? That not just are they not getting as much opportunity to make those decisions and evaluate them for themselves, but also they're surrounded by people who are not living in the now. We're not thinking about, okay, so we might well want to look back at the past as to how to inform ourselves of what we want to try, but then we don't evaluate the success based on what's just happened. We evaluate it based on what our fear or our confidence tells us about what's going to happen in the future. So they're surrounded by people who are not talking about the now. They're not getting a lot of chance to be in the now for themselves. So our kids just really don't get a lot of practice in this evaluating, what just happened? Did it work? Did it not work? Why did it work? Why is this important to me even? What do I care about for myself and for the people around me? All of that stuff is gone. And so, and I shouldn't say gone, but it's reduced. It's significantly reduced in today's day and age. So what we want to start talking about with our kids is a couple of things. So the first one we want to think about is allowing them greater decision-making opportunity. So I very, very rarely actually try to take choice away from my kids. I give them as much choice as is physically possible. And I want to caveat that with, that depends on where I'm at on a day. So if I am having a really, really hard day, as much choice as possible might not be very much. If I'm exhausted, or if I have a lot to do, or if there's something going on, then as much choice as possible is not as free range as I might like it to be, but it's as much choice as possible. So that fluctuates day to day. And then the second part I do is I talk to kids about how did their choices work out. I talk to them about how my choices worked out. So, for example, if I give them, this hasn't happened recently, so I'm going to make an example up, but say, for example, in an afternoon, if I give them a lot of sugary treats because I want them to have a lovely afternoon and maybe there's something fun happening or what have you, and then I find that the sugar crash happens at around the time they're supposed to eat dinner, so then that all goes poorly, and then we're late to getting to bed because that whole mess just becomes really, really difficult, then I don't talk about the frustration of them not doing what I've asked. I talk about my frustration with my not thinking about how afternoon sugary treats would flow on into dinner time, which flowed on into bedtime. So the conversation we're having is not, it's so late you need to get into bed. I might say those things, like I might say it is necessary now, it's late, you need to get into bed, we need to do the best we can. But the focus of the conversation, whether I can get it in that time, whether I do it when we're settled down and in bed, whether I need to do it the next morning, the conversation isn't about how do you start to behave better when you're overtired. The conversation is about that whole experience would have been avoided if I had thought about those sugary treats a little bit more. So I talk about that, and then the same goes with them. Now, when I'm talking to them, I don't feed them analysis very much. I try to keep it broad, open questions. So it might be, how did that feel when that happened? When you spoke that way to your sister, how did it feel in your body? I'm trying to bring their emotional awareness in. I'm also trying to bring in for them, there's lots of things going on here. It's like, what's going on for you, but then also what happens for you when you treat somebody else in that way. There's all these, and then I start to talk about, well, how do you think your sister felt? And all of those kinds of things. So we're asking all these questions to bring in more just thought about what's going on. And that brings them more intentionality as well. The more practice they have at thinking after the fact, the more they'll have intentionality in making the choices in the first place. So the sneaky thing about this is that the more you evaluate how things work, the more you notice that when you're emotionally aware and resilient and you can focus on all those things will be easier and feel better, right? And so in the end, it does bring about more emotional awareness and more resilience and all of those things that we'd like our kids to have. But this is the strategy that helps to make them better decision makers in themselves. It helps to make them better decision makers when we're not there. So whether they're at daycare, at school, at their grandparents' house, whether it's even on the playground where you're not close enough to be able to hear what they're doing or saying, like any of those times where we don't have control, it's this process of evaluation that helps them to grow in their ability to behave truer and truer to themselves and be more and more sensitive to other people because we're bringing in this analysis and this introspection. Now, of course, the benefit of starting these conversations when they're tiny is that we make it the norm. Like, how many of us, this definitely happened to me, is that when we didn't have those conversations about introspection just generally, the conversations that happen in my household, and Mum, you don't need to correct me if you watch this and it turns out that it's not your recollection, but my recollection of my household when I was growing up, that the conversations were about what we should or shouldn't have done, whether the behaviour was good or bad, whether we were acceptable or unacceptable in how we'd approach something, how we should have done better. It was all of this like feeding the children like almost like scripts, like this is how you are to behave, this is how you are to see things. Whereas what we want to do is actually get them to connect more with what's going on inside of themselves and more with their perspective of what's going on. So it doesn't mean to say that I will never bring in other perspectives, but my focus first and foremost is on getting them to connect with themselves and getting them to notice what's going on for other people rather than what's my interpretation of the situation. So, and I was on that tangent. Ended up on that tangent because we were talking about when we start these conversations early, like in contrast to what happened in our families, if when we got older and things started to get very difficult and dicey in our relationships or something that we'd done that we felt really uncomfortable about, you can imagine none of us, well, I shouldn't say none, many of us didn't take as many of those conversations, not only to our parents, but to other trusted adults, because we expect that the conversation we get back may or may not be true, but we expect that the conversation we'll get back is how we should have avoided this, or how we should have handled it better, or whether we are good or bad, or getting fed, like what is the answer? How are you supposed to handle this? When often what we wanted was either just someone to be there, or perhaps we wanted someone to help us behave in more integrity with ourselves. And perhaps we really knew that this is something that we needed to be comfortable with how we took those next steps. And that can start to happen. Like, I've had conversations with my younger children from very young ages, like 3 and 4, about how, even 2 actually, where we're talking about things that I don't reckon I would have spoken to my parents about because of all the shame that was involved. And at such a young age that shame starts to kick in, because our society has started to lean on shame as the main way that we handle tricky behaviour. And that's at all ages. And so because of that, we really need our kids to be able to recognise that we are a shame-free zone, or at least if we do end up in shame because old habits die hard, or perhaps it's a really triggering issue, that we will be able to recover from it later. So this has been a really kind of broad and conceptual topic, but I'd really like to hear what your takeaways are from this and whether it's resonated for you. So the 2 steps to take is to ask your children more questions and give them more space to make those decisions, so that they can then assess those decisions and evaluate how they played out, so they get better and better at making those decisions. If you try those out, I'd really like to hear how it goes, and please leave your comments in the comments under this video. Thanks so much.